For the next 3 weeks, we're in a 3-week series that's going to lead us into our Christmas series. And we're going to be in a series that's a relatively obscure book. You probably, unless you're a Bible student, you may not have even read this book before. It's a little minor prophet called Habakkuk. And we'll talk about that in a minute, but I'll just tell you this, how I prepared for this week. This is not the only way I prepared, thank God. One of the ways I prepared was by watching the 2003 Jim Carrey movie, Bruce Almighty. In fact, we got a little still from that. Technically, I'm not allowed to watch Jim Carrey movies. Someone whose name rhymes with Andrea has put some limits on me that I'm not to watch Jim Carrey movies, or as she says, she has to live with Jim Carrey for the next 2 weeks. Alrighty then. So, but I stayed up late after she went to bed. So, Jim Carrey in this movie, he plays a self-absorbed reporter, Bruce Nolan, who is very critical of God because of how his life is going. Right? For example, his career. He's been in his career working really hard, and he's working for a promotion, and he's not the one that gets the promotion. It's his coworker, Evan, who gets it. And he's like, that guy? Really? That guy's the one that gets the promotion? So he's critical of God. He says God's not fair. He basically, his perspective is God's not doing a good job at being God. And the implication is that if Bruce were God, he would do things very differently. That's sort of implicit, right? And so God gives him a shot at being God. And of course, comedy ensues because it is in fact a Jim Carrey movie. So I share that because that's a helpful framework. If you're not familiar with Habakkuk, that's a familiar or a helpful framework for thinking about it. Because, and here's the difference. The movie Bruce Almighty, it's a fictitious comedy, and it's created for entertainment. As we get into the book of Habakkuk, we have somebody who's questioning God, but it's a tragic lament. It's not for comedy's sake. He's dealing with very real problems in his immediate surroundings of his nation, but also globally as he looks around what's happening around the world. And so we're going to be in that today. So we titled this morning, How Long, O Lord? It actually comes directly out of today's text. Alternatively, I might have titled it, You're Doing What? Because that's sort of the tone. But Habakkuk, again, it's a relatively obscure minor prophet. When we say minor prophet, we're not talking about its importance, we're talking about its length. And so as you come to the Hebrew scriptures, there's a section called the prophets, and there's 5 major prophets and 12 minor prophets, and that has to do with just the amount of material they cover. But chronologically, here's what that means. We're going back to the Hebrew scriptures. So we just left off in Ephesians, which Ephesians, if you were to put a timestamp on it, it's in the 60s AD, right? It's right around the 60s. Now we're going to jump backwards and go back all the way to almost 600, around the 600s BC. And so we're jumping way back in time. And the general setting for this book, it's like the tectonic shifts that are happening in the ancient Near East at this time related to who's in charge, who's the world power that is currently reigning. And so I'll give you a map here. If you look at this map, here's the geographical orientation for where we're going to be these next 3 weeks. Our study is set specifically in Judah. So if you look down at the lower, like the southwest corner of your map, you see Judah there. That's a helpful reference point because that's where Habakkuk is, and that's the people that he's initially talking about. A couple other helpful reference points is if you look to the left, just for a little further west, you see Egypt. If you look to the north, you see Israel. So there's Israel and there's Judah, and those are 2 distinct people groups at this time. We'll talk about that in a minute. And then to the east, over there, you see Babylonia. Just kind of a little bit northeast, you see Babylonia or Babylon, and that's relevant to our series. So that's the geography. Let's talk about the chronology for just a moment. This is world events. This is, by the way, this is just world history, right? This is nothing. If you are a student of world history, we're going to be talking about shifts in global power that you've studied in other texts. This is the way that these played out in the biblical times for those people. So beginning in 931, and by the way, this is BC, so what we're actually doing is we're working backwards down to zero. So you're going to notice the numbers getting smaller as they become more current. So 931 BC, the once united kingdom of Israel divides. So back in David's time, David united the 12 tribes to become one nation. In 931, they divided, becoming the northern tribe of Israel, or the northern kingdom of Israel, and the southern kingdom of Judah. So the larger one was Israel, and that was the 10 northern tribes. And then the 2 southern tribes were Judah, which is basically Judah and Benjamin, but Benjamin's kind of like Garden City. It's like a little part inside of, Garden City is a city inside of Boise. Benjamin was a city or a tribe inside of Judah. So you go down to 722 BC. It's about 200 years after that split of the kingdom. The northern 10 tribes of Israel disappear into captivity to the current world power at that time, which was Assyria. And they are never heard from again. Okay, we have stories about, like in Ezra and Nehemiah, about exiles returning from captivity. But when we're talking about that, we're talking about the southern tribes of Judah and Benjamin. The northern 10 tribes, we never hear from them again. They are dispersed and scattered. In 625, so about 100 years later, Babylon asserts its independence from the crumbling Assyrian Empire, which means this is the beginning of a shift in world power. Up until that time, Assyria was the reigning world power. Now Babylon begins to assert its independence, and that's kind of the beginning of the end for Assyria, which then comes in 612 BC when the Assyrian capital of Nineveh falls to the Babylonians. And that's like the defining moment that Babylon is now the reigning world power and Assyria has been demoted. So flash forward to 609 BC. That's King Josiah, who's the current Davidic king in Judah, meaning he comes from the line of David. He dies in battle at Megiddo. And you can read his whole story, his whole reign. It's summarized in 2 Kings 22 and 23. But that's significant. So let me talk just for a moment about Josiah before we move on. The death of Josiah is significant to our study because during Josiah, he reigned for about 31 years, a little over 3 decades. During that time, he rediscovered God's law, the Pentateuch, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. It had been forgotten. That is how dark the nation had devolved to by the time that he was king, that when he found the book of the law, it was an epiphany. It was a discovery. And having found it, he was heartbroken and he repented personally on behalf of the nation. And then he led the nation in unprecedented spiritual and social reforms. Again, that story is in 2 Kings 22 and 23. Those 2 chapters tell the story. And part of what it tells is the state of the people at the time that he began those reforms. Because of all the things he had to do, and it's incredibly bleak, it's incredibly dark. A lot of it's centered around their relationship with God, and instead of relating to God exclusively, they are consumed with idolatry, with worshiping foreign gods and idols. Worship at the temple that Solomon had built had become so corrupted that there was now prostitution, cult prostitution was happening at the temple as part of their worship. There was witchcraft that had to be stopped. I mean, this is dark, bleak times. But here's the thing. After his death, there again, you look at that timeline in 609. After his death, the nation immediately backslid into all of the corruption that he had led them out of. So when you come to 605 and 597 and 586, you'll see that we list 3 captivities in which Babylon makes 3 attacks on Judah, and that all culminates in the complete destruction. Each time that Babylon came in those 3 years, 605, 597, and 586, every time Babylon came, there was more damage done to Jerusalem, and the temple got looted multiple times, carrying away all of the things that Solomon had made for worship, got carried away to Babylon. But all of it culminated in 586 when Jerusalem and the temple were completely destroyed. In fact, 2 Chronicles 36 has a summary of basically there's 2 decades. If you think about Josiah dying in 609 and then the ultimate destruction of the Jerusalem and the temple happening in 586, that's just just over 20 years. Here's a summary of that time. Listen to this. 2 Chronicles 36, 17 through 20. So the Lord brought the king of Babylon against them. The Babylonians killed Judah's young men, even chasing after them into the temple, slaughtering them in the temple. They had no pity on the people, killing both young men and young women, the old and the infirm. God handed all of them over to Nebuchadnezzar. The king took home to Babylon all the articles, large and small, used in the temple of God, and the treasures from both the Lord's temple and from the palace of the king and his officials. Then the army burned the temple of God. They tore down the walls of Jerusalem, burned all the palaces, completely destroyed everything of value. The few who survived were taken as exiles to Babylon, and they became servants of the king and his sons until the kingdom of Persia came to power. So that's what's coming. The key dates, as you turn in the text of Habakkuk, we're not going to find any dates listed. There's no timestamp for when exactly he gave his ministry and did his work. But we can get really close to guessing when his conversation with God took place. It's in, if you look at that timeline again, somewhere right in between 609 and 605 is when Habakkuk seems to have taken place. So again, there's not a timestamp inside the book, but there's some clues that we can look at. And so here's a couple of clues. One, we know that the nation has already backslid from Josiah's reforms. So Josiah died in 609, and then after that is when the nation backslid into everything that he had just led them out of. So the nation's already backslid, and Babylon is a known threat. Which means King Josiah, when he died in a crossfire, basically in between Babylon and Egypt. Babylon had come against Egypt, and they weren't even trying to fight Jerusalem at that time or Judah. And King Josiah inserted himself and got killed in the crossfire. So in 609, Babylon's already on the rise, is already defeating other nations. But in the text of Habakkuk, they haven't attacked Judah yet. So we can pretty confidently say that this thing that we're about to study and read over the next 3 weeks, it happens right in there between 609 and 605. So that's the historical context and the geographical context for the writings. 2 more things about Habakkuk the man before we jump into the text. One is that he's introduced as a prophet. When we get into the text, it just calls him a prophet. We're not told anything else about him. Other prophets or other minor prophets and writers, we're usually given a little bit more about them. We're told about their lineage, who their parent was, who their grandfather, that type of stuff, and which kings that they were ministering to, whether it was northern kingdom or southern kingdom, how many kings they prophesied to. If you just turn like one page over from Habakkuk to Zephaniah has an introduction that's more common. It says, the word of the Lord came to Zephaniah, the son of Cushi, son of Gedaliah, son of Amariah, son of Hezekiah, in the days of Josiah, the son of Ammon, king of Judah. So it just gave a timestamp. It told you where he was, when he was. Habakkuk, we're just told he's a prophet. And here's what that means. To say someone was a prophet in this context might be a little bit different than what we think about prophets. Because oftentimes when we think about prophecy, we're thinking about predictive statements. Here's what's about to happen. And that was a small part of what Old Testament prophets did. But basically their job, their calling, their vocation was to speak God's word to God's people. Okay? And it was more often than not, it wasn't predictive. It was just about what was currently happening. And often what they were doing is they were referring back to the law, the same thing that Josiah discovered. They were looking back to Deuteronomy 28, and they were looking at the conditions in their nation and then speaking to those conditions. And when there was things that were happening that were positive, they would speak the blessings of Deuteronomy 28 and say, if we are obedient to the covenant, here's what God has promised. And when they see disobedience to the covenant, then they announce, here's what God has said will come as consequences if we keep going down this road. Okay? That's what prophets did. They spoke God's word to God's people. So they were calling people back to covenant obedience. The other thing about this book that is unique in terms of Habakkuk is that this is not an oracle to the people. So again, the prophets, typically what they did is listening to God and searching the law. They spoke to the people. Habakkuk never in his book, it's only 3 chapters long, he never speaks to the people. He's actually having a conversation with God. It's not really, oftentimes we talk about conversing with God, talking with God. What do we call it? Prayer. So we start off in Habakkuk's talking to God in it. You could call it a prayer. That would be pretty generous because it's more of a complaint. And in fact, in chapter 2, he actually calls it that. He actually says, I'll wait and see what you have to say about my complaint, right? So you can picture with what we know about Habakkuk, you can picture him, he's grabbed the Festivus pole, and he said, it's time for an airing of grievances, and I'll start. And he starts airing his grievances to God. Habakkuk 1, verse 1. The oracle that Habakkuk the prophet saw. O Lord, how long shall I cry for help and you will not hear? Or cry to you, violence, and you will not save? Why do you make me see iniquity? And why do you idly look at wrong? Emphasize that first question, how long? Because that's the overarching question. There's a lot of questions inside of that, but the big question is how long are you going to tolerate this before you do something? And it's external, it's what he's seeing in his people, but it's also internal. You hear in that there's a little bit of a complaint about what he's experiencing in his vocation, because he's called to speak to people, God's word to God's people, but they're not responding. And God's job is to do the heavy lifting, right? To come alongside and affirm the message and say, yeah, when you don't do the things in Deuteronomy 28, here's what happens. And to bring those consequences to help the people want to obey. I think that maybe Habakkuk had been very excited about Josiah's reforms. I mean, as a prophet, as a minister to God's people, when there was all of those reforms that Josiah brought that were nationwide in Judah, like when he saw those things, he had to be so excited. But as soon as Josiah died, they just melted away. Have you ever had that? Have you ever sensed that a big thing was happening, that God was on the move, and there was something happening that gave you a sense of that, and then it just didn't go anywhere? And in fact, it got worse. These are the things that he's dealing with and he's complaining about. Maybe Habakkuk's question is, why do I care more than you do? Can you not see what I'm seeing? Right? So in the next verse, he says, let me paint a picture for you of life down here in Judah, since you seem to be unaware of what's going on. Let me tell you what I'm seeing. Verse 3, destruction and violence are before me. Strife and contention arise. So the law is paralyzed, justice never goes forth, for the wicked surround the righteous, and justice goes forth perverted. Habakkuk's complaint, it's summarized in that line. He surveys his people, and again, this is the nation of Judah. Israel's been gone for over 100 years, But he surveys his own people, and he says, look, we're characterized by violence. He names violence twice. Iniquity, which is just a junk drawer word for sin. Wrongdoing, destruction, strife, contention. He's like, everywhere I look, it's just ugly. And he says, the righteous, or the wicked surround the righteous. So there's a minority, a remnant of righteous people who are trying to do the right thing, but they're overwhelmed by the majority that surround them. And he says, as a result, there is no justice in our land. There's no goodness. So that's it. That's his complaint. That's his grievance. He says, all right, so there it is. I'll hang up and listen, right? And now it's God's turn. Beginning in verse 5. Look among the nations and see. Wonder and be astounded. For I am doing a work in your days that you would not believe if told. For behold, I am raising up the Chaldeans, that bitter and hasty nation, who march through the breadth of the earth to seize dwellings not their own. Chaldeans is Babylon. It's another name for the Babylonians. Again, Babylon is the rising world power that just replaced Assyria. They precede Persia. After Babylon will be Persia and then Greece and Rome. So you know the whole world history. Here's where they're at in that. But already the reputation of the Babylonians is known. It's their empire building by swallowing up other nations. That's a known thing. That's what it says right there at the end. He says, they march through the breadth of the earth to seize dwellings not their own. Now, remember, Habakkuk implied in his complaint, in his grievance, that God was not doing anything to intervene. And God says, oh, I am doing something. It's just that it's so offensive, so incomprehensible to you, so unexpected to what you're looking for that you don't get it. God goes on to say, verse 5, he says, look among the nations and see. Wonder and be astounded. Oh, wait, I saw that. Verse 7, they are dreaded and fearsome. So now God is going to poetically describe the ferocity and the cruelty that was exhibited by the Babylonians. So he's going to say it poetically. He says, they're dreaded and fearsome. Their justice and their dignity go forth from themselves. He said, if you think that there's not justice in your land, wait till you see their brand of justice. Their horses are swifter than leopards, more fierce than the evening wolves. Their horsemen press proudly on. Their horsemen come from afar. They fly like an eagle, swift to devour. Which historically, we just looked at that chronology, the timeline between their rise to world power, like just them standing up independent of Assyria in 625, and by 609, they're taking other nations. Like, that's on the scale of global history, that's remarkably fast. Verse 9, he says, they all come for violence. All their faces forward. They gather captives like sand. At kings they scoff, and at rulers they laugh. They laugh at every fortress, for they just pile up earth and take it. And then they sweep by like the wind and go on. Guilty men whose own might is their God. Again, God poetically describes the contempt and the disdain that Babylonians treat the other nations with that they conquer. Including their practice of, he says, they gather up captives like sand. Like just sweeping their hand across the beach and just grabbing a handful of sand, only it's people's. The Babylonians, they continued the Assyrian policy that Assyria had used when they were the global world power of deporting captives out of their homeland to do a couple things. They would discourage them. It would break their sense of national unity. It was disruptive and disorienting. It broke their resistance and then assimilated them into their own culture. Babylonians were known to lead their captives away. Sometimes they took them back to Babylon, especially if they were like rich or educated or could contribute to Babylonian society, they would take them back to Babylon. If they were just the poor working class, they would just scatter them to other nations, just take them away somewhere else. So they would kind of break their national sense of pride. But they would lead them away through hooks in their noses. They would string person to person to person through hooks in their noses and just walk them back like fish that have been caught, like just so many fish. So if Habakkuk had questions about what God wasn't doing, how do you think he feels? We shall not die. See, they had watched Egypt already get carted off to Babylon, but thought themselves invincible because as a he. If I could paraphrase that, I would say, seriously? Like Bruce Almighty, Evan gets the job? He's like, seriously? You're using them? Now he's got more complaints, more questions. His response is basically to say, if that's your solution, your cure is worse than the disease. Because now, as Habakkuk looks at them, he's been talking in those first several verses, he was talking about his own people. But now when he looks at the Babylonians, he's going to grade on the curve, and he's going to say, well, you know, you're using wicked people to judge people that are more righteous than them. How does he say that, the last one? Why do you remain silent when the wicked swallows up the man more righteous than he? He doesn't say swallows up the righteous person. He just says the one that's more righteous than him. Because he's grading on the curve. He's like saying, well, you know, if that's like, you're using orcs to come against trolls. Why would you do that, right? It's a pretty low bar. Habakkuk's not done complaining. He goes on, verse 14. He says, and here's where you hear the way the Babylon treated people. You make mankind like the fish of the sea, like crawling things that have no ruler. He brings all of them up with a hook. He drags them out with his net. He gathers them in his dragnet, so he rejoices and is glad. See, their reputation already precedes them. Therefore, he's talking about Babylon as if he's personifying Babylon, the people. Say, he sacrifices to his net. He worships his might and his brutality. He makes offerings to his dragnet, for by them he lives in luxury. His food is rich. Is he to then keep on emptying his net and mercilessly killing nations forever? Okay, do you hear how Habakkuk's concerns, his questions just expanded? Because his initial questions they started with some self-pity, right? Why do you make me look at this? Why did you make me care about these things while you don't do anything about it? Why did you make me care about this? That was rooted in a broader distress that was for his people. And he was concerned about the way he saw his people treating one another within his nation. But now in light of this development, he's now asking global questions about justice and oppression, about what's going on in other nations. And he's questioning, how do I, this seems like a disconnect between what I know about you, God, and what I see you doing. So I've got some complaints. Chapter 2, verse 1, he ends with his complaint with this. He says, I will take my stand at my watch post and station myself on the tower. I'll look to see what he will say to me and what I will answer concerning my complaint. Like, what do I tell others about what I complain to God? Habakkuk has said his piece. He now plans to station himself like a watchman on the wall. This is a known thing in Israel. He says, I'll take my stand in the watchtower and I'll watch. And he's watching for two things. He's waiting for God's response. You know, I told you my problem. What are you going to say? Maybe he's also watching for Babylon to see if they really are coming. I think he reminds me a little bit of Jonah. We studied Jonah a few years ago, and the book of Jonah ends with Jonah sitting on a mountainside looking out over Nineveh, actually over Assyria. This is back, 150 years previously. And he's waiting to see what God's going to do. And Jonah doesn't really approve of it. And right now Habakkuk's in the same place where he said, I'm waiting. I don't really approve of what you're doing. So stay tuned for next week when you hear how God responds. That's coming in chapter 2. For now, we're going to look at a little bit of application that we can find just in this opening chapter. So first of all, application point number 1. Don't confuse God allowing something with God endorsing something. Okay? And this is scalable. All the application we're going to talk about the rest of the morning is scalable, meaning this can be in your personal life, or it can be in your family, in your city, your nation, your world. And the challenge is we believe in a sovereign God, and so why doesn't he intervene when we think he should intervene? But the fact that God allows something doesn't mean that he's endorsing that thing. God allowing Israel to backslide after, or Judah to backslide after Josiah's reforms, that wasn't God's approval, right? And so, but that's what's happening with Habakkuk. He's confusing God's allowing something with God endorsing something. Know that sometimes God advances his purposes in ways that are unfathomable to our small minds. You will have greater peace if you remind yourself that a God that we could explain would not be God. And so God will at times do things that we don't get. His purposes are bigger, higher, deeper, and also better than ours. And yet they're often inscrutable. Peter put it this way in 2 Peter 3. He said, the Lord isn't really slow, or the Lord isn't really being slow about his promise, as some people think. No, he's being patient. Some people confuse his slowness with his patience. He's not being slow. He does not want anyone to be destroyed, but wants everyone to repent. He hasn't acted yet because he's waiting for repentance for everyone. But the day of the Lord will come unexpectedly as a thief. That phrase, the day of the Lord, that's a key phrase for understanding a lot of the Hebrew scriptures, the Old Testament, all the prophets, what they were predicting and what people were expecting when Jesus came. So we're going to talk about eschatology here for just a second. This brings us to our second point. We don't know how long before God acts globally, but he will act. Until he does, we can expect both good and evil to coexist. So let me show you a little diagram of the first century Jewish expectation. I referenced this a little bit briefly last week. I want to give you a visual for it. So this diagram reflects the Jewish eschatology, or their expectation at the time of Jesus' birth. So if you look at that black dot there at the bottom, it's a black dot, primarily black, has a little bit of white at the beginning. But that black dot represents the beginning of mankind in human history. And it's depicted in darkness because of the rebellion in the garden when our first parents rejected God's rule. And they said, we will do things the way we want, and therefore introduced sin and darkness to all of creation, introduced death that began to ripple out, not only through people, but through all of creation itself. And so that age is referred to as this present evil age sometimes in the New Testament. All creation has been subjected to sin and evil. So there's consequences of mankind's rebellion. You see again the white dot at the beginning. God created everything good. Mankind rejected it. And because of that, this age is characterized by sickness, disease, death, violence, greed, selfishness, hoarding, hunger, starvation, poverty, loneliness, depression, addiction, people using and abusing one another, wars and suffering. Bottom line, evil seems to prosper. That's what that dark line represents. But what they were expecting was this day when the day of the Lord would break in. And it was this, see that white line. And it was this decisive moment that God kept promising through the Hebrew prophets. I think the first place we find it is in another minor prophet called Amos. But he kept promising the day of the Lord. And that was a day that at that time, God would reestablish his good rule over all of creation. And so you see that white line that's just eternal. It has no beginning and no end. At some point, God's good rule is going to break back in and restore creation. The enemy would be destroyed. All things would be made new. So what people were expecting, because they were listening to prophets like Amos, they were expecting this decisive moment when God came in, and it would characterize two things. It'd be characterized by blessing and judgment. Blessing for those who knew God and worshiped him, and they would be purified and refined and reestablished. But also judgment on those who rejected God and who persecuted his people. And they're expecting that to all happen. Okay, that's what was in the hearts and minds of Israel when Jesus arrived on the scene. But Jesus left this age without bringing an end. So if you look at this next slide, the early church had to reevaluate their eschatology and basically realize that the day of the Lord was a two-stage event. And instead of being one decisive moment when everything changed, it was a two-stage event beginning with Jesus' earthly ministry, culminating his death and resurrection and ascension, but then culminating the whole thing, the second event being his second coming. What that created was an overlapping between this age and the age to come. Sometimes it's been called the age of tension, you can see why, because the effects of this this age are still present: sin, death, disease, all the stuff, violence, everything that Habakkuk was crying out against, it's all still present. But the effects of the age to come have broken in as well. And so it's an age of tension. It's also called the church age. So this age continues for now, and the rule of Satan is still in evidence. But the age to come is also present. And with the age to come comes the down payments, little installations of the complete restoration that will one day be. So it's what Jesus proclaimed when he stood up in the synagogue when he began his ministry. And he quoted from Isaiah 61, and he said, "I'm here to tell you that I bring the year of the Lord's favor." And the word year there, it's metaphorical, right? It's not talking about 365 days, 52 weeks. It's talking about a new era of God's favor. He's describing, if we can get that slide back, he's describing the age to come has broken in. Good news, the year of the Lord's favor is here. But now there's this conflict. That mixed experience is what we will continue until the second coming. And it's the reason that we can move through darkness and illness and all of the things that make us question with hope, because we know it won't always be like this. So to the question, how long, O Lord, we aren't told. Habakkuk was asking, when are you going to bring an end to this? He knew about the day of the Lord. He's saying, when is it? God hasn't told us. Here's what Jesus has said. In John 16:33, he says, I have told you this so that you may have peace in me. Here on earth, here in this age, you will have many trials and sorrows, but take heart. I have overcome the world. James, we're going to skip that last slide. Last application point, number 3. Habakkuk teaches us that God is not threatened by our questions and our wrestling with the disconnects that we experience in our relationship with him. Some of what I just said was theological. Some of you may have found that helpful. Some of you may have found it confusing. It's conceptual. It's where we live. We live in this age of tension. But this part gets really personal. It takes it out of the theoretical, theological. It's not academic. When we're asking the type of questions Habakkuk is asking, whether about our own lives or our loved ones or our nation or what's happening in the world, it gets really personal. Habakkuk invites us to bring to God those disconnects, to bring our grievances, what we're seeing, what we're experiencing. Here's what Habakkuk teaches us, that it's only by honestly wrestling with our questions that we can find the capacity to trust God. You will deal with doubts, with questions. That can lead us into deconstruction. It can lead us into walking away, and disappointment. It can lead to a lot of things, or it can lead us into talking to God. So let me close with some questions. And actually, maybe let's do this. Because today's not, by the way, today's not going to be neat and tidy. We're not going to tie a bow on this pig. Okay? Next week, be very happy. You should come back next week. But Habakkuk wasn't a comedy. It was a lament. It's something that we're not very comfortable with as Americans. We're not very comfortable with lament, with things that aren't tied up with a nice, happy ending. But unless we wrestle with those things, we don't have an honest relationship with God. And God is not threatened by our questions. The fact that he didn't just smite Habakkuk for his insolence and instead responded to him tells us that God's okay with it. He's not threatened when we question him. So would you stand with me? And here's how we're going to close today. I'm just going to put up some questions. These are some sample application questions that have been rattling around in my mind and heart this week of ways that this might apply to different ones of our lives. It's not comprehensive. This is just kind of to prime the pump. But here's the invitation, is we're just going to take a few moments in silence to just wait on the Lord and to allow ourselves to question the things where we have a disconnect between what we know about God or what we thought he should be doing and what we're seeing or feeling or experiencing. So for example, where are you when evil and injustice prevail and persist? When the effects of living in this fallen world overtake us? How long do I or we have to cry out to you before you hear, until you act? Maybe your question is along the lines of, God, do you care? Does suffering really matter to you? God, how do I trust you when blank is so different than I think it should be? Wanted it to be. Prayed for it to be. God, why aren't you answering my prayers for change? I think that one is deeply personal. When we're wrestling with something that we know is not God's best for us, and we're praying to be changed and not experiencing that yet, not experiencing that transformation, that's a real crisis of faith. Now here's the invitation from God. Just bring it to him. Jesus modeled this for us in the Garden of Gethsemane when he prayed to the Father and he said, if there's any other way to accomplish your purposes than what I'm about to have to go through, take this away from me. He was incredibly honest with God about his feelings. A little more honoring than Habakkuk, but he's the Son of God, so. But you know what? What we're told is that angels came and ministered to him after that prayer in the garden when he told God what he was thinking and feeling and experiencing and then said, I trust you. It was in that space that angels came and ministered to him and gave him the grace to then walk what he had to walk through. And he actually still had to walk through the crucifixion. But he received divine grace to do so. I think for some of us, as we ask these questions in this book of Habakkuk, what it does is it opens us up to a greater faucet of grace, where God gives us the peace to be in a world where we have trials and troubles, and to take heart knowing that he has overcome the world. So what's your question? Would you just take a moment to share that with your Heavenly Father?